My name is Sarah Thompson, and I'm a 35-year-old ordinary housewife. I live in the suburbs of New Jersey with my 8-year-old son Mike and my husband John. Our house is a 2-story home surrounded by a white picket fence, and we live what our neighbors might consider an enviable life, the very picture of the American dream. But there was one shadow over our seemingly perfect life. That was my relationship with my mother-in-law, Margaret. Margaret was a beautiful and elegant woman, even in her 70s. Her house was just a 15-minute drive from ours, and her mansion was famous in town. Margaret still works on the front lines as the CEO of the real estate company left behind by my late father-in-law. It's been 10 years since I got married, but my relationship with Margaret has been strained from the start. She always looked at me critically and seemed to look down on my middle-class background. "Sarah, don't you think that dress looks a bit cheap? Oh my, are you still just an ordinary housewife? You should be more ambitious." She would throw such words at me with a pleasant smile. I always felt hurt but maintained a calm demeanor and smiled back. "Thank you, Margaret. I'll take your advice into consideration." John seemed to notice the tension in our relationship and would sometimes try to mediate. But his kindness could sometimes backfire. "Mom, Sarah is trying really hard. Please give her some credit." Whenever he said that, Margaret's gaze would become even sharper. Still, I continued to make efforts to improve our relationship, if only for Mike's sake. Mike adored his grandmother, and Margaret was kind to her grandson. Every Sunday, we have dinner together at Margaret's house. On those days, I help with the cooking, feeling nervous. My salad might look out of place next to Margaret's perfect dishes. But with a desire to cherish family bonds, I continued to visit without giving up. As I spent my days like this, I suddenly realized something. There might be a deeper reason behind Margaret's harshness. Every time I saw her lonely figure, a small sense of sympathy began to grow in my heart, little by little. However, an event that would greatly change those feelings suddenly struck us. It was a Sunday morning, just like any other. We were preparing for dinner at Margaret's house as usual. Mike was excited to show his grandmother his new picture book, and John was packing his work documents into his bag. Suddenly, John's phone rang. Seeing his expression cloud over in an instant, I felt a tightness in my chest. "Mom, she's collapsed." John's voice was trembling. We hurried to Margaret's house. When we arrived, the ambulance had already left. The housekeeper, Mrs. Wilson, explained the situation to us while crying. I was preparing breakfast when I suddenly heard a noise. When I went to the living room, Mrs. Thompson had collapsed. We rushed to the hospital, but the worst news was waiting for us there. Margaret had passed away before arrival. The next few days were like being in a fog. As we were busy with funeral preparations, my head was full of memories with Margaret. Her harsh words, the occasional kindness she showed, and the last conversation we had. The funeral preparations proceeded according to Margaret's wishes. It was to be held at her luxurious home, and many industry colleagues and friends were expected to attend. As I stood in my black morning dress, checking the arrangement of flowers and photos, I was struck by a strange feeling. The thought that my complex relationship with Margaret was ending here made my chest ache. Mike couldn't understand his grandmother's sudden death and kept asking, "When is Grandma coming back?" Each time, I held back tears and gently repeated my explanation. John, despite being overwhelmed with grief, was busy with the detailed arrangements for the funeral. Every time I saw him, I felt a stronger urge to support my husband. The day before the funeral, we gathered at Margaret's house for a final check. That's when an unexpected event occurred. Margaret's house, usually filled with an elegant atmosphere, was now wrapped in silence. We were moving around, each taking care of our assigned roles for the final confirmation of the funeral arrangements. John was checking the guest list, while I was arranging the flowers. Meanwhile, Mike was wandering around the living room, looking bored. Watching his small back, I could painfully feel my son's inability to understand the situation. "Mike, could you please stay quiet over there for a bit?" I gently called out. Mike nodded silently and sat down on the sofa. However, it's unrealistic to expect an 8-year-old boy full of curiosity to sit still for long. After a while, he sneaked off towards Margaret's study. I was so focused on arranging the flowers that I was late in noticing Mike's movement. "Mike? Where are you?" I called out, and a small voice replied from the study. "Mom, look. It's a letter from Grandma." I rushed into the study. What Mike was holding was a thin cream-colored envelope. On it was written, "To Sarah," in beautiful cursive. It was undoubtedly Margaret's handwriting. "Mike, where did you find this?" "In Grandma's desk drawer." It had Mom's name on it. Confused, I took the envelope. I never imagined Margaret would have written a letter to me. Considering our relationship, I couldn't help but wonder about its contents. "John, could you come here for a moment?" I called my husband. When John entered the study and I explained the situation, he too looked surprised. "Mom wrote a letter, to you." We looked at each other and gently opened the seal. Inside were 2 sheets of notepaper filled with meticulous handwriting. I took a deep breath and began to read. The moment I saw the first sentence, my hands started to shake. "Dear Sarah, if you're reading this letter, I'm no longer in this world." I tried to continue reading, but suddenly felt like everything was going dark. John supported my shoulder, asking worriedly, "Are you okay?" "Yes, I'm fine," I answered, but my heart was pounding fiercely. What could be written in this letter? What did Margaret want to tell me? I took a deep breath and turned my eyes back to the letter. And in the next moment, my world was about to change completely. My eyes followed the lines of the letter, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Margaret's words were about to completely change our relationship. "Sarah, I sincerely apologize for treating you harshly. The truth is, I had no choice but to do so in order to protect you." I gasped. John was reading the letter over my shoulder. "My son, John, has a dangerous secret. He..." At that moment, my hand trembled, and I almost dropped the letter. John quickly grabbed it and continued reading. I could see his face turning pale. Sarah, John had previously. I involuntarily covered my mouth with my hand. The unbelievable content continued. The evidence is in the safe. The passcode is. John tried to snatch the letter from me, but I held on to it desperately. Sarah, stop it. That's a lie. John's voice echoed through the room. At that moment, I noticed Mike standing in the corner of the room, looking frightened. Mike, leave the room, I said in a trembling voice. Mike left the room with a face on the verge of tears. John, is this true? I asked in a shaky voice. John's eyes began to take on a maniacal gleam. Mom is lying. She's trying to frame me. His behavior was so abnormal that I felt fear. And then, Margaret's last words flashed through my mind. Sarah, if anything happens to me, it might be John's doing. Be careful. At that moment, I understood everything. Margaret's sudden death, John's strange behavior, and now this situation. John, I'm going to check on Mike for a moment. I tried to leave the room calmly. However, John grabbed my arm. Don't go anywhere. I instinctively pushed John away and ran out of the room. I rushed down the stairs, found Mike in the living room, and took his hand as we headed for the front door. Mike, we're getting in the car. Hurry. We quickly got into the car and left the house. While driving, I took out my cell phone with trembling hands and dialed 911. Help us. My husband, we're in danger. Guided by the operator's calm voice, I explained the situation. Then, I was instructed to head to Margaret's house. My mind was in chaos, but one thing was clear. I had to protect Mike and myself. And I had to reveal Margaret's truth. For the few minutes until we reached the police, I gripped the steering wheel with a prayer-like feeling. When we arrived at Margaret's house, several police cars were already waiting. I exhaled in relief as I got out of the car, holding Mike's hand tightly. Mrs. Thompson. A stern-looking female detective approached us. I'm Detective Lisa Brown. I'd like to talk to you. I explained the situation in a trembling voice. Margaret's letter, John's abnormal reaction, and our escape. Detective Brown listened with a serious expression. At that moment, a police car arrived with its siren blaring. An older male detective got out of the car. Hey, Lisa, he said, looking tired. We've arrested John Thompson. We apprehended him at his home. Hearing those words, I felt my knees go weak. "Oh, were we late?" the older detective muttered. "What do you mean?" I couldn't help but ask. The detective let out a deep sigh. Actually, Margaret Thompson had consulted with us a few weeks ago. She feared she might be killed by her son, John. I was stunned. Margaret had even consulted with the police. We were also investigating, but the evidence was insufficient. The detective's words trailed off. Detective Brown interjected, "Mrs. Thompson, can you show us Margaret's letter?" I handed over the letter with trembling hands. Detective Brown carefully placed it in an evidence bag. We'll conduct a house search now. Mrs. Thompson, you and your child will be moved to a safe location. I nodded while hugging Mike. Under police protection, we were to be taken to a hotel. Before getting into the car, I looked back at Margaret's house one last time. It's hard to believe that just a few hours ago, we were preparing for a funeral here. Mom, can't we go home anymore? I heard Mike's small voice. It's okay, Mike, I answered, trying to sound strong. We're together. As the car started moving, my heart was filled with complex emotions. I couldn't imagine what would happen next. I was only thinking about revealing Margaret's truth and protecting our safety. The next afternoon, Detective Brown visited us at our hotel. Her expression was even more serious than yesterday. Mrs. Thompson, I'm here to inform you about the progress of the investigation, she began quietly. The contents of Margaret's letter were true. I gasped. Detective Brown continued. We've reinvestigated the death of John Thompson's previous wife, Emily Parker. It was processed as an accidental death 10 years ago, but new evidence has been found. In my mind, memories of the past raced by like a flickering light. When I met John, he had said he had recently lost his wife. A recording tape of Emily just before her death was found in Margaret's safe. It contained John's voice threatening her. I covered my face with trembling hands. Mike was watching TV in the next room, but he was peeking in, worried about my condition. And as for the cause of Margaret's death, Detective Brown hesitated for a moment. There's a high possibility of poisoning. We found a medicine bottle with John's fingerprints on it. At that moment, I understood everything. Margaret had treated me harshly to protect me from John. She knew her son's true nature and was trying to keep me and Mike away from danger. Mrs. Thompson, we need your testimony, Detective Brown said quietly. John is denying everything, but with your testimony and physical evidence, we can indict him. I took a deep breath. I understand. I'll cooperate. At that moment, Mike came into the room. Mom, when is Dad coming home? I hugged Mike, holding back my tears. Mike, Dad won't be able to come home for a while. But we'll be okay. We'll definitely get through this. Detective Brown smiled gently. Mrs. Thompson, you're a strong person. It might be tough from here on out, but we'll support you. I nodded and looked out the window. I can't imagine what life will be like from now on, but thanks to Margaret's courage and truth, we can take a new step forward. And a feeling of gratitude towards Margaret warmly enveloped my heart. Detective Brown's words weighed heavily on my heart. John's trial began, and I was to stand as a witness in court. As I entered the courtroom, my eyes met John's. The face of the man I once loved now had a coldness like that of a stranger. The prosecutor called me, and the questioning began. Mrs. Thompson, did you ever feel anything unusual in your life with the defendant, John? I took a deep breath and answered. Yes. John would sometimes suddenly become angry, especially when the topic of his mother, Margaret, came up. John's lawyer interrupted. Objection. Speculation. The judge said overruled and urged me to continue. I continued in a trembling voice. When I read the letter from Margaret, John flew into a rage. And then. Here, I hesitated for a moment. But I had to tell the truth. For Margaret, and for ourselves. John shouted, "Mom is lying. She's trying to frame me." And then he tried to threaten me. As the courtroom fell silent, the prosecutor presented decisive evidence. The recording tape found in Margaret's safe. From the tape, John's voice threatening his former wife Emily played out. The terrifying words, "If you tell anyone, I'll kill you," echoed throughout the courtroom. I looked at John. His face was pale, and sweat was pouring down like a waterfall. Next, the prosecutor submitted the medicine bottle used to poison Margaret as evidence. It indeed had John's fingerprints on it. "Mrs. Thompson," the prosecutor turned to me and said, "Margaret lost her life to protect you." The moment I heard those words, tears started flowing from my eyes. The love hidden behind Margaret's harshness, and her courage. Now that everything had come to light, I was filled with a deep sense of gratitude towards her. The trial continued for several days, and in the end, John was found guilty. For the murder of his former wife Emily, and the attempted murder of Margaret. He was sentenced to life in prison. As I left the courtroom, I looked back at John one last time. The figure of the man I once loved was no longer there, just a criminal standing. After the trial, a new life began for Mike and me. Thanks to the inheritance Margaret left us, we don't have financial worries. However, it will take time to heal the wounds in our hearts. One day, I went to visit Margaret's grave with Mike. "Grandma, thank you," Mike whispered in a small voice. I also spoke through tears. "Margaret, thanks to your courage, we can live safely. Thank you so much." From that day on, I decided to start moving forward. I began learning how to manage the real estate company Margaret left behind, and little by little, I'm stepping into the business world. Mike has also gradually regained his smile and is getting used to life at his new school. Sometimes, the past events appear in my dreams. But each time, I remind myself, we have become stronger. Protected by Margaret's love, we are walking a new life. I don't know what life will be like from now on. But we have hope. With the gifts of truth and courage that Margaret left us, Mike and I continue to walk towards a new future.